All right. Sorry about the late start. I was just finishing up doing the David Feldman show. Was only supposed to go till 7, but the schedule was kind of a mess, and it dragged out to 7:15. So if you're mad about waiting, um, direct all of your complaints to Feldman. Tell him he's a bastard. Tell him you hate him. Do all that stuff for sure. On that show, we were talking, of course, about the presidential debate from a couple of days ago, and what that debate showed about Trump, the way that Trump has changed since 2016. If you think back to his debates with Hillary, never mind when he was ramming through the Republican field over the course of all those debates in 2015 and early 2016, the Trump that you got back then, he would lob these bombs, which did sometimes involve interrupting people and heckling them. But he seemed very calm about it. He just seemed like a very talented insult comic, kind of doing this schoolyard bully routine and talking about Jeb Bush's mom. And when Jeb got furious and frustrated, that Trump was out there on a national debate stage, talking about Barbara Bush and how his mother was the most wonderful woman ever, Trump said, "Oh, maybe she should run for president." And that was all pretty funny, honestly. I remember I used to talk to Michael Brooks about this all the time. The bottle of water when Trump was making fun of Rubio, and it was very entertaining to watch. That he was doing, somebody says in chat, right? He was doing like the equivalent of a Comedy Central roast, which is exactly right. I mean, that's what he was doing, and he was actually very good at it, and it was pretty funny. But part of why he pulled that off was he seemed very calm and really disinterested, even, right? Like his demeanor the whole time was like he was off standing in a corner somewhere, smoking a cigarette and cracking the occasional joke at the expense of everybody else there, and sure, including sometimes doing some interrupting and heckling. But it didn't really seem like he was that emotionally invested in anything that was going on. Even the same thing at the debates with Hillary, where he didn't perform as well as he did in the Republican debates. But it was certainly nothing like what we saw this week. And again, he was throwing some bombs and interrupting, and sometimes to say crazy, disturbing things like, "Oh, if I'm president, you'll be in jail." But it was still pretty funny. And it was because John Ross asks about the David Feldman show. Just go into any podcatcher, wherever you listen to podcasts, just search the David Feldman show. You'll see it right away. It's just an audio thing. There's no YouTube version of it. Not sure what Ian Banks novel you're referring to, but when Ian Banks is science fiction novels, whereas Ian M. Banks, the ones without the M, were realist novels. Like The Crow Road, for example, is actually one of my favorite novels by that Ian Banks without the M. Oh, the one behind me. Sorry. Let's see. This one is Stonemouth, Song of Stone, Steep Approach to Garbadale. Oh, and this one is The Bridge. I think those are all the Ian Banks novels behind me. In any case, part of the reason that Trump's insult comic routine in 2016 was so effective was that he seemed very calm, right? So he was the unruffled ruffler of other people's feathers. And then also he had some pretty good comic timing, and none of that was on display on Tuesday. What we saw on Tuesday seemed like, maybe I just lived in Miami for too long, but it sure seemed like it snorted several lines of something. And he had, and I think that what he was, the difference, right? Actually, somebody in the chat over on Feldman's show like I think nailed this, like the difference between 2016 Trump at debates and 2020 Trump at this debate, which honestly, I don't think, I mean, I might be wrong about this, but I know that, of course, the Proud Boys, which is a quasi-fascist paramilitary group, essentially, I know they were thrilled that he did that little shout out to them, stand by, was it stand back and stand by? I think they have that on t-shirts now. But overall, I think just as rhetorical pro wrestling, as a performance, I don't think even the hardcore Trump people enjoyed that very much. All the defenses I've seen of him were all like, okay, well, sure, he may be, and then they had some phrase like rude or whatever, but, right? And even though he was just as rude in 2016, I never saw the defenses of him couched in the, oh, sure, he's whatever, but it was always just, oh, yeah, Trump's awesome. So I think that even as hardcore supporters, weren't really enjoying the show in the same way this time, or at least that's the sense that I got, certainly. And I think that the difference, and I saw somebody in the chat over here kind of referring to this, was the Feldman show. I don't think it actually is. I mean, the recording might be on YouTube later. It's not recorded live on YouTube, I don't think. I think it's just recorded live on Zoom, but the same way I do my show with as a Zoom webinar, right? So there can be essentially a Zoom studio audience there. But honestly, I think the difference, and I see somebody in chat saying, okay, he pulled it off because he was the outsider, he had also an insider with the rich. Trump was your drunk friend with a chip on his shoulder dishing out secrets. As president, he's no longer this outsider. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. But honestly, I think my little amateur armchair psychology guess here is that in 2016, he definitely didn't think he was going to win. Right up till the bitter end, he didn't think that. He did not have a victory speech ready. He didn't really even have a victory party because he thought it'd be embarrassing, because he thought he was going to lose. But somebody says Feldman is sometimes recorded live on YouTube. I don't know. But in any case, I think that Trump definitely didn't think he was going to win in 2016. Honestly, I don't think he wanted to win, particularly in 2016. I think he was pretty happy to just have a lot of fun on the campaign, and really get himself out there such that he would have guaranteed himself a good media spot after it was all over, but not actually have to do the job later. And so that meant that he was free to just have fun being this kind of schoolyard bully insult comic. Whereas I think now, again, he doesn't necessarily think he's going to win, but this time he's losing power and he's terrified of that, right? He seemed to be, I think that now I think he's terrified of losing the re-election, and that really shows. So he's not calm and cool about it. The guy off in the corner smoking a cigarette, cracking jokes about everybody. Now he seems nervous, and it shows. That would be my take on that. Somebody asked, let's see, about the movies. I'm not gonna. I mean, if you're curious about anything in particular, I'll tell you. But there are like 2 dozen movies behind there. I guess I'm not gonna read that off. But in any case, I think that somebody in chat says it was a move to get NBC to pay him more for The Apprentice. I mean, I would totally buy that. Chris Olson, I know it's a cliche to have a copy of Infinite Jest that you've read like 10 pages of, but I did in fact read every word of this motherfucker. I didn't the first time I got it. My copy of Infinite Jest was given to me by a friend in grad school, who the first time we ever hung out, she recommended that book to me. And this was so long ago, like Wallace was still alive. It wasn't quite as big a deal back then. And she said that she thought I'd really like it. And then that next year, she actually gave me a copy for my birthday. And I read about 100 pages of it, and I kind of lost interest. It was good. I was enjoying it, but I don't know. I got distracted and by something else, and then a few years later, well, she wasn't my wife then, but my girlfriend back then wanted to read it, and we kind of like passed it back and forth reading it, and I actually did read the whole thing. Then I'd actually really recommend it. I think it's a very good book. I honestly, I think it's kind of crazy that now there's this weird, very online thing where people sort of say that it's like, oh, it's like a bro thing to like Infinite Jest. I think the idea that it's a bro thing to like a 1,000-page novel that's all about how mindless entertainment makes us less thoughtful, and how excessive irony can make us less empathetic. Like that seems, uh, I think that's a very weird overreaction to the sort of previous waves of love for David Foster Wallace. Yeah, somebody says in chat, nothing more meathead than reading 1,000 pages. In any case, I'm probably more than a little scattered right now. So I just got into to Michigan. So my wife and I packed up the apartment in Georgia. We're moving back here for a while. We're both teaching online anyway this year. So we spent Monday and Tuesday and much of Wednesday packing up the apartment and putting our stuff in a storage space and driving. And we thought we were going to make it all through in one night, which was delusional in retrospect. So I ended up having to stop at a hotel somewhere in Tennessee last night. And I actually literally got into the house like 5 minutes before East Lansing, although I actually did live in Kalamazoo for 2 years. I went to, that was where my master's program was. But in any case, like I literally got in the door like 5 minutes before I started up Feldman. So I'm more than a little scattered here. But if you want to send over some super chats, put some questions in those, I will, to orient me. I'll certainly do that. I saw somebody saying, "Oh, what podcast or music do you listen to on long drives?" It really depends. I'll sometimes listen to novels on Audible. Like that's honestly kind of my my preference. This drive wasn't doing it for that much of the time. I mean, sometimes I was just listening to music. I have cheesy musical tastes, so I was listening to Ozzy's Boneyard on Sirius. But I also listened to a few hours of The Difference Engine by William Gibson and Bruce Sterling. But otherwise, yeah, let's see. Oh, somebody says, who do you think is an underrated or underheralded writer we're not reading on current politics? I guess it depends what you mean on current politics. So I think that, for example, Rob Larson, who writes about technology and economics, from a socialist perspective, I think he's very good. He probably doesn't get his books probably don't get quite as much love as they could. I am a huge fan of Freddie DeBoer's, only book, the Call to Smart, which I think I had him on the show, but I think it's a really interesting critique of meritocracy, even as an ideal. DeBoer basically, he starts out by talking about the college admission scandals from 2 years ago, whenever that was. And how a lot of the reason that was scandalous is because people were getting their kids ahead illegitimately, right? And showing that the pretense of meritocracy is just that. Oh, yeah, somebody was talking about staying in a hotel. Trust me, I am extraordinarily paranoid about COVID. I did not like having to do that. But I mean, at that point, you're going to, I think that both of us were just too exhausted to drive, and that would have been much more dangerous under the circumstances. Yeah, I read Nathan Robinson's review of DeBoer's book, and wasn't convinced by his critique. I'll say why in just a second. Diego asked in Super Chat, what's a good book or film about the Russian Revolution? And so I'll answer that before I get back to DeBoer. So certainly, as far as films go, so the super classic one is Eisenstein's October. I also like, I guess it's also about the Russian Revolution, about the dress rehearsal in 1905, not the successful revolution in 1917, but Battleship Potemkin is amazing. But the other one I've always really liked is that old Warren Beatty movie Reds, which is about John Reed, who of course wrote the classic account of the Russian Revolution, 10 Days that Shook the World. Oh yeah, somebody noticed scar tissue on the bottom shelf, which I've got to say, if you have as much of a soft spot for rock memoirs as I do, that one is extremely entertaining. That'd be recommended. But anyway, so yeah, that Reds, which is about Warren Beatty plays John Reed, and that's a classic. That's a movie that I've always liked quite a bit. And as far as books go, obviously there is 10 Days That Shook the World. There's the China Mieville book, which just came out in 2017. I guess that's not just anymore, but I know none of these are particularly deep cuts, right? But I will mention a couple more, which are Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, which I remember. I mean, I read it forever ago, but I remember really liking it. Victor Serge wrote a bunch of books about this. Somebody mentioned, which are all really good. I mean, Victor Serge is a great writer, and I think his political perspective was exactly right. He talked about having a double duty to the revolution, a duty to support it, and a duty to criticize the missteps and even crimes that took place in its name, even early on, that really undermined the whole thing and helped lay the basis for Stalinism later, for the rise of the system that really got away from the original goal of workers' democracy, right, of abolishing the division of society into workers and capitalists, and really got to a point where you had state officials who were playing much the same role that capitalists would play in a regular market economy in many ways. But in any case, I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you again for the super chat, Diego. So yeah. Oh, by the way, before I forget, since the Anthony Kiedis, the scar tissue came up, one of my favorite things I learned from that book was just the simple fact that he comes from Grand Rapids, which is where I went to college. And I think that helps explain the relentless romanticization of California and Red Hot Chili Peppers lyrics. All right. Dylan Thompson says, Ben, I miss your song on TMBS. Also, The Foundations of Leninism by Stalin is pretty good. I'm very unlikely to praise anything related to Stalin. Although his book about the national question, just reflects Lenin's view on that. Not any later view that he might have had is also actually pretty richly ironic, considering his later extreme suppression of national minorities in the Soviet Union. But that book, Stalin's book on the national question, Richard Wright said that was the book that made him a communist. I do actually have somebody asked about the Ian Banks' science fiction novels. Actually, I do actually have some of those. I know I read at least a couple of them, but just don't happen to have any on that shelf right now. But in any case, I also miss well, not necessarily the song itself so much as being asked if I was ready for the song. That's definitely an open wound. But in any case, we're talking about before that. Oh yeah, and somebody, since I mentioned Trotsky's book on the Russian Revolution, somebody asked about Trotsky's memoir, My Life, which, yeah, no, there's a lot of really good stuff in there. Actually, also, yeah, sorry, that's right. Michael Cameron reminds me that I was getting into Freddie DeBoer and why I was unconvinced by my friend Nathan's critique of that book. So, first of all, just real quick on the point of the Freddie DeBoer book, because if you kind of don't get this as a starting point, then what Nathan's critique is and why I'm not convinced of it, none of that's really going to make sense. So the point of the book is to say, look, obviously we don't live in anything remotely resembling a real meritocracy. DeBoer certainly doesn't claim we do. Honestly, almost nobody with a straight face says that we do. Maybe some like college Republican somewhere says that. But obviously we don't, right? There are lots of, fail sons of the wealthy elite who continue to be in the wealthy elite. There are lots of very smart and talented poor people who stay poor, right? So we clearly don't actually live in a meritocracy. But DeBoer's point is that the structures of American capitalism, I really want to say late capitalism, but of course that might, let's put it this way. Calling it late capitalism expresses a wish, not a certainty. But in any case, so it's not just the structures of American capitalism and capitalism in general as they exist right now are unfair to the extent that they don't resemble that ideal of a meritocracy, but also DeBoer's point is they're unjust to the extent that they do represent that, right? To the extent that some people can get ahead and make it into the professional managerial class, by being very, very good at school and all that, right? And other people can't because they're not so good at it. That is also incredibly unjust because academic ability, like every other kind of ability, is unevenly distributed throughout the population. And by the way, I wouldn't equate academic ability with, being smart in some general sense. I think when we talk about being smart, look, one, that's a fuzzy word. It refers to lots of different cognitive abilities that don't always go together. I think, it's very hard to meaningfully measure. Somebody points out in chat, capitalism is at least late stage in the sense that you can talk about cancer being late stage, that it's metastasized to everything, which is actually not a bad, not a bad analogy for the way that markets, kind of reach into every aspect of life under the, and yes, people have been using the phrase late capitalism forever. That's one of the reasons it sounds a little funny rolling off the tongue. But in any case, the point is that American society is not just unjust to the extent that it's not a meritocracy, it's unjust to the extent that it is a meritocracy, because academic ability, right, which again is not the same as being smart, which absolutely, like Michael used to say, is contextual, that, being smart can mean lots of different things in lots of different contexts. But if we're not talking about that incredibly broad, general family resemblance concept, right? In other words, something that a lot of things that might be loosely tied together certainly don't always go together. But if what we're talking about, right, specifically, the kind of smart that it's a cult of is the kind of academic ability that will be very good for getting people to climb the class ladder, right? Get into law school and get a job at a good firm and, all that stuff, right? That, like all other abilities, is wildly unevenly distributed throughout the population, which in the case of any other ability would be an uncontroversial thing to say. And I think honestly, for most people in most contexts, it would be an uncontroversial thing to say about academic ability because, yeah, of course, no kidding, right? Not everybody is equally good at school, and it's not just because some people are trying harder than other people are. There are all sorts of things that go into that, like sub skills that go into that. that some people are better at than others. And some of that, this is more controversial, but it seems to be true, right? Some of that seems to be genetic. And the part of Freddie's book that was most controversial probably was where he was reviewing some of the behavioral genetics literature about this. But honestly, I don't even think it was essential to his argument, because it doesn't really matter that much how much of variations in academic ability you think are due to genetics and how much you think are due to other aspects of what's sometimes, how much you think are due to what's sometimes called the non-shared environment, which just means all of the things that go into making one person's experience different from another person's experience, or not just experience, but all the things that affect their cognitive development that would differ from individual to individual, right? Going from things that happen prenatally up through what their home life is like, whatever, right? Whatever you think the combination is, the upshot is that by the time people are in school, by the time they're studying for the SAT or the LSAT, when they're in college applying to law school in that example, at any stage in this process, by the time somebody gets in that classroom, there are all kinds of things that go into their starting point, what kind of academic abilities they have that are not under their control, and they're not even under their teacher's control, really. In fact, so the overall point of the book, the main argument of the book is meritocracy is a terrible ideal. A society that really did distribute resources in accordance with people's academic abilities is unfair for the same reason that a society that distributed goods according to basketball abilities would be unfair, right? Trust me, in that society, I would be living in extreme poverty. Or a society that distributed resources in accordance with singing ability, right? Yeah. Of course, there are people who, could be good singers if they had enough, vocal, training and lessons and all that stuff. But if somebody, and then there are people like me who, I can barely carry a tune to save my life. And in a society that distributed rewards according to singing ability, I would be screwed. And I think I'd be screwed no matter how many hours I spent going through vocal training, right? And so any of these things would be wildly unfair, including distributing honors and resources in accordance to somebody asked which Jacobin contributor is best at basketball. I don't know. I just know it's not me. Bhaskar is very, very into watching basketball, but I've never seen him play, so I can't speak to that, and I really can't speak to any of the others. But the point is that because you're talking about an ability, right? Something that is, to a great extent, of course, abilities can be nurtured or they can be starved, but ability is something to a great extent beyond your control. And that's part of why it's so wildly unfair to say that some people can have a path to a middle-class existence and some people can't, on the basis of those kinds of differences. Yeah, I know, Carrie. I just dug this out of the suitcase, clearly got something on it. I have not had a chance to, to even wipe that off. And yeah, there are lots of people who have various reasons, various conditions that might, mean that they actually have academic abilities that aren't being recognized, totally separate question. The point is that even if we were really good at telling when people had innate academic ability and when they didn't, it would be wildly unjust to say that some people are going to live in poverty, whereas others can have good middle-class jobs because of those differences, the same way that it's unjust to have some people have much better life outcomes than others based on anything else that's outside of their control. Whether that's whether that's skin color, whether that's sex, whether it's anything else, right? That the reason we see all that as unjust also applies to the idea of a truly meritocratic society, right? I mean, Gattaca is a truly meritocratic society if we just mean innate ability, right? If you've seen that movie. So that's the main argument of the book. And the secondary argument of the book is that we shouldn't have is that the way that so-called ed reformers yes, Dylan Thompson says in Super Chat, speaking of carrying a tune, I hope you have put the bug in Griscom's ear about Sturgill. We will definitely get to him. But the secondary argument of the book is that the way that so-called ed reformers, charter school enthusiasts, etc., demonize teachers and teachers unions is extremely unjust for some of these same reasons. And in particular, the idea of something like merit pay, right? That's an educational so-called reform, right? That's been popular for a while, which is tying teachers' pay to student performance. But of course, student performance isn't just a function of how good a teacher is at his or her job. That's Freddie's point. That in that secondary argument, main argument is there are differences in academic ability. So meritocracy is a terrible, immoral ideal. Instead, he thinks we should have socialism. In the short term, he thinks we should have social democracy so that the costs of losing the meritocratic rat race are less. And the long term, really, he's actually much more radical than I am, right? Like that, I think that any kind of socialism that it's realistic to imagine achieving in the near future at this historical juncture would still involve some market mechanisms, even if, you still, whatever remaining market sector you had, was only consisted of worker-owned firms renting property from the state. But Freddie DeBoer is really a full communism guy, right? And he thinks that because meritocracy is such a monstrously unjust ideal, and the only real solution to that is to smash capitalism. That's the point of his book. And so what's Nathan's critique, and why am I unconvinced by it? Well, Nathan spends a lot of time in his review, and I do think he scores a few hits in the review. I don't think that he's wrong about everything. Doesn't change my overall opinion of the book. But in the review, he spends a lot of time objecting to what he perceives as Freddie's not believing that some people have the potential to learn certain things. And I think I'm going to write something about this. I think that Nathan, who I have nothing but positive feelings for, co-wrote an article with him which should be, well, it's all in the print issue that just went out of Current Affairs. It should be in the online edition in a few weeks. He blurred my first book. Nathan's great, right? But we do sometimes disagree, and this is one of those cases. And Nathan was really reading Freddie DeBoer's book as saying that some people don't have the potential to learn certain things, and really objecting to that. And Nathan's objection was but to really find out what people's potential is, we'd have to have something much better than the kind of education system that we have right now. In fact, maybe we'd have to have the kind of education system we could only get under socialism, because, all these meritocratic professional managerial class rat race pressures would be taken off of it, and lots of resources would be lavished on the education system and so on, right? By the way, somebody said something in the chat about worker co-ops and self-exploitation, which is a really interesting point. I do have stuff to say about that, so I'm going to do that right after this. But just to finish up the point about Nathan and Freddie DeBoer, so Nathan is reading Freddie DeBoer as saying that some people don't have the potential to learn certain things, and objecting to that on the grounds that you can't really tell that from the very inadequate, underfunded, distorted in 1,000 ways by capitalism education system that we have right now. And if Freddie were making the argument that Nathan takes in his reading, I would see his point, but I just don't think that's right. In fact, the reason I don't think that's right is if you read the book, The Call to Smart by Freddie DeBoer, I recommend that. Go over to their website of Red Emma's, and my favorite, speaking of worker cooperatives, that's a worker-owned bookstore, so I always try to plug them rather than Jeff Bezos' sweatshop. But the reason Freddie, in the book, spends a lot of time talking about the difference between relative learning and absolute learning. So absolute learning is, have you learned X, right? Have you mastered some body of knowledge or some skill, right? And then relative learning is, how is your mastery of that skill relative to other people's, right? And if you're talking about a meritocracy, remember the entire point of the book, or the main point of the book, is to criticize meritocracy, to say it's a lousy ideal, and instead we should have a vastly more equal, and in Freddie's view, really communist society. That's the main point of the book. The secondary point of the book is that we should stop beating up on teachers and teachers' unions for over student performance, because it's just not under their control to the extent. Carrie, again, this was in the suitcase. I'm sorry, I just pulled it out before I did this, but we should, relative learning is what we're talking about when we, McMindfulness moved my cheese. I do think there's a good answer to that point about self-exploitation. Trust me, I'm going to get to it. But just real quick, right? So absolute learning is, have you learned this skill, or have you learned this body of knowledge? Yes or no, right? That's absolute learning. Relative learning is like you're standing in the class, right? So if there was like a pass-fail test on whether or not, after a certain grade, you've grasped the basics of arithmetic, that would measure absolute learning. Relative learning is about your position relative to other students, right? Are you doing better or worse than other students? And of course, if we're talking about meritocracy, about the idea that we want a society where the people with the most academic ability rise to the top, that people get ahead on the basis of how good they are at school and then the later professional rat race, then that is necessarily about relative learning, not absolute learning. Everybody could be doing better, as far as we could raise the floor enormously in absolute learning. In fact, as Freddie documents the book, we have raised the floor a great deal in absolute learning, but there would still be all kinds of relative differences, just because, like anything else, right? That everybody who plays for the Detroit Red Wings is much better at hockey than I am, but that doesn't mean that some of them aren't better at others, right? They have all basically mastered how to play hockey and how to do it much better than any amateur, but some of them are just way better at it than others, right? Like every skill is going to have relative variation, even among people who are very good at it. And so this is where, to my mind, Nathan's critique doesn't really hit, because when he's talking about potential, right, then he's really talking about absolute learning, right? Do you have the potential to learn something? And maybe there are a few points in Freddie's book where, the difference isn't as clear or whatever, right? But like overall, he's very clear about this. He actually goes on a great length about this, so when you're talking about potential, right, saying, oh, well, we don't know what, Nathan has some example in his article, like, we don't know whether John could learn engineering, right? Because that's something, this example in the book, like a third of, or 2/3 of first-year engineering students end up dropping out, something like that. Nathan says, yeah, but we don't know whether John could learn engineering unless we devote like unlimited time to helping John learn engineering, unless it's like a major goal of social policy, make John an engineer, and we give him like round the clock one-on-one tutoring, all this stuff. So that's irrelevant to Freddie's point, because Freddie's point is about relative learning. Because remember, before you can criticize an argument, you have to know what it's an argument for or against, right? What's the conclusion? Because if you're criticizing an argument, you're saying, oh, the premises don't support the conclusion. Well, before you can answer that question, you need to know what the conclusion is. And the conclusion of Freddie's argument, his main argument in the book, is that meritocracy is a lousy ideal because it punishes people for things that are not entirely in their control. That's it, right? And the secondary argument is, let's stop demonizing teachers when for student performance, because it's not entirely under the teacher's control either, right? He's got this great analogy about, like, if you worked at a widget factory and you were told, oh, your pay is going to be cut, this will be the equivalent of merit pay for teachers based on how this widget is doing, but you're only going to get the widget after it's already been mostly created, and even when you're attending to it and trying to shape it, it's going to spend 2/3 of its time outside of your hands, being carried around by other people who could damage it. But we're going to cut your pay if this widget doesn't turn out great. That would be obviously insane, and it's the same thing for teachers. So those are the two arguments of the book. Main argument, meritocracy bad because it punishes people for things outside of their control. Secondary argument, demonization of teachers and teachers unions bad because it punishes people for things that are outside of their control. There's a John in the chat saying, lol, but I don't want to be an engineer. So the reason I think Nathan's point about making John an engineer, I don't think the character was named John, but it doesn't matter, right? Let's just say John, right? That there we go. All right. The reason that that whether or not John could become an engineer if enough resources were lavished on him is just flatly irrelevant to Freddie's point in the book, is because the point in the book is about relative learning. The fact that some people wouldn't need as much one-on-one attention to learn how to be an engineer as other people is the point. That's the only point, right? That because, like all abilities, it varies. Like almost all abilities, it's not entirely a function even of how hard you're trying, right? Different people have different abilities. That's how humans are. Different people have the same abilities to different extents, and it's not entirely under your control. Somebody in the chat says, isn't Trump proof no matter how much resources are lavished on someone, it won't necessarily ever take? Yeah, there may be cases, right? But like, let's even say there aren't any cases, right? Let's say that the worst performing people, if you lavish enough individual attention on them, they would be able to learn whatever, right? Wouldn't touch Freddie's point. Freddie's point is it's unfair to economically punish some people for not having the same academic abilities as other people, because academic abilities, like all abilities, vary between individuals. You know, he doesn't think they vary between races or genders or anything like that. He rejects all that, as he should, as pseudoscience. But it's an obvious thing, like, put behavioral genetics aside. Let's say there is a 0% genetic component to variation in academic abilities. Okay. Is there an environmental component? Is some of that component about the non-shared environment, like what happened to you prenatally, or even what house you live in and how easy it is to find a place to read there? If so, that's enough to make Freddie's argument work, because the argument is it's unfair to punish people economically for things that are outside of their control, whether we're talking about students or teachers. And so I think that Nathan's critique would only work if the argument was about absolute learning, that, oh, there's some people who just can't learn this or that in any possible kind of society. But I don't think that's Freddie's argument at all. I think his argument is that there are my friend Cole is making me laugh in the comments, but in any case, because Freddie's argument is about relative learning, that, you know, the fact that some people might learn something faster than others because of factors outside of their control, whether it's about genetics or environment, some incredibly complicated combination of genetics and environment, doesn't matter, right? It's outside of their control, so they shouldn't then not be able to have a good middle-class life because of it. That's the point. All right. There was a question earlier about, somebody Somebody says, is it only a moral argument about fairness? What would a more equitable economy means in terms of strength? So if the question there is about, we can, thank you very much for that, Artem Masvidal. Thank you very much. And somebody asked, don't you think Nathan is simply criticizing the implications and over-reliance on genetic exploitation for performance? I don't think so. I mean, at least I think if so, he's really misunderstanding how much or little of a role that plays in Freddie's argument. That's my take, but I think I've ranted about that for long enough. Uh, and to go back to the question about self-exploitation, I think this is actually really important. I'm co-writing a book, and this actually also relates to the question we just got about a more equitable economy and strength, which what I take you to mean by that, right, is that when we think about capitalism, obviously there are all kinds of things that any decent person should hate about capitalism. That one is what we were just talking about, right? That due to factors totally outside of people's control, or at least to a large extent outside of their control, some people are much less able to rise out of poverty than other people. And that's monstrously unjust. That's terrible. Another thing that we should hate about capitalism is that it is rapidly killing our descendants, with runaway climate change. Another thing that we should hate about capitalism, and this is where the sort of classical Marxist critique really comes in, is that under capitalism, most people have no realistic choice except to go to work for a capitalist, right? Only some people can become capitalists themselves. Karen Webster, thank you for the super chat, says, no training a fish to walk on land. Yeah, fair enough, right? Again, I'm not even necessarily taking a position one way or the other about whether there are people who are incapable of certain bits of absolute learning, right? And look, I think there might be. I think I indicated earlier that I strongly suspect that even if I'd had around-the-clock lessons from an early age from the best choir masters in the world, my singing voice would still suck. And I'm sure that there are mental skills where the equivalent is true for some people. Fair enough, right? But I don't think whatever you think about that issue one way or the other, I don't think it's really relevant to what Freddie DeBoer is saying in the book. But go back to what I was saying about capitalism, right? There are all these things that we should hate about capitalism, primarily the fact that some people have that only a small minority of the population, or how small it is depends on which capitalist society we're talking about at which time, but always a minority, right? Only a minority of the population actually owns their own businesses. The rest of the population has no realistic choice except for to go to work for the capitalists, which means for 8 hours, and of course it's only 8 because of past successes of the workers' movement and fighting for an 8-hour day, for 8 out of 16 waking hours most days of the week, you have to submit yourself to the will of a capitalist, and who has more control over you, as Noam Chomsky loves to point out, than a totalitarian government has over its citizens in most contexts. Even the North Korean government isn't going to tell random citizens, while they're at home alone or whatever, when they can go to the bathroom and when they can't, right? But of course, bosses do tell workers that, right? When they could go to the bathroom, how long they have to take. If you work in one of Jeff Bezos's warehouses, you have electronic surveillance to see not only how long you take in there, but how long you're taking to walk to the bathroom and walk back. And your pay could be docked, you could be disciplined, you could lose your job if you're routinely taking too long, right? That's a really extreme level of control to have over another human being. And that is extremely objectionable. So there are all kinds of reasons that we should hate capitalism, but of course not everything about capitalism is bad. There are some ways, obviously, as Marx and Engels certainly acknowledge, that capitalism is wildly better than systems that came before it. Certainly in terms of producing abundance technologically, even if it's not been distributed in a way that we'd like. And so I think the question about what a more equitable economy would look like and how strong it would be has to do with that. Okay, well, hold on. If we had a more equitable economic system to get rid of the things about capitalism that we hate, would we then lose some of the good things about it, the dynamism that it does allow, the creation of various forms of technology that make people's lives better, that raise standards of living, certainly compared to where they were. Would we get rid of those things too? Right? That's the challenge, and I don't think we should be snarky or dismissive about this challenge. I think those of us who are anti-capitalist should take it seriously and have models of how socialism can work that can plausibly address it. And this is going to take us back finally to the point about self-exploitation. Um, because if you don't have any market mechanisms at all, well, I think we might eventually get there, right? I think that it's possible that we could have what's sometimes called fully automated luxury communism eventually. And let me just say real quickly what I mean by that and why I think that's plausible. When you talk about fully automated luxury communism, you're talking about roughly like the second stage in Karl Marx's two stages of socialism and the Critique of the Gotha program, or what he kind of hints at in the Fragment on Machines from the Grundrisse, which is the idea that we could have the sort of future, basically, that like libertarian Silicon Valley entrepreneurs dream about, except also have socialism, right? In other words, that maybe if it really is true that eventually technology is going to get to the point where the robots will be doing like 99% of the work that humans were doing before, if that actually happens and we're still living under capitalism, yes, it is absolutely true that lots of innovation comes from government R&D programs, but I think it's also true, and I think it should be admitted that really existing planned economies like the one in the Soviet Union weren't that good at it. They had their moments, right? But overall, they weren't that good at it. And certainly there were calculation problems about lining up production priorities with consumer preferences. All right. If we got to the point where the robots really did take almost all of the jobs, right, where it really was the case that like 99% of what humans currently have to do was done due to advances, artificial intelligence, whatever science fiction thing you want to assume here, was done technologically, not by humans, then of course, if we're still living under capitalism, that's a dystopia, because it means that most people don't have any form of support, except maybe some Yang Bucks UBI thing that would be like the equivalent of like a late Roman bread ration, right? After, or the late Republic, early Empire Roman bread ration, when so many people who had been small farmers, their farms had been bought up by these big landed estates. They were just living as paupers in the city, living on this daily bread ration, right? That's a dystopia. But on the other hand, if we get to that point technologically and we're living under socialism, we have workers control the means of production, then that's actually utopia, because it just means as technology gets better and better, we can just sort of vote ourselves fewer and fewer work hours a day until you get to maybe the sort of end point of that, which would be this idea of fully automated luxury communism, which is just a way of saying, hey, if we're at that point technologically where almost all of the work that's currently done by humans is done by machines, and the machines are collectively owned, then maybe there's so little left to be done by humans, and there's so much abundance that what little has to be done by humans can just get done through everybody pursuing their own interests, through everybody just does whatever, spends their time on whatever they feel like spending it on. I'm sure there'd be tons of very bad poetry and lots of people whose voices are just as bad as mine, would be trying to pursue dreams of being singers, and that would go very badly. But also some people's passion is for computer engineering. And so stuff like that might be enough that in such a society, what little work had to be done by humans would just kind of be done naturally through everybody kind of freely pursuing their own interests, just doing whatever they want with their time. That's that Critique of the Gotha program, Aaron Bastani kind of dream of what we could get to eventually. And I don't rule it out, right? I'm somewhat agnostic about that. I think maybe the technology will eventually get to the point that'll happen. I hope so. Sounds wonderful. But what do we do until then? Right? What kind of socialism can we have until then? And of course, under capitalism, we have the soft coercion of economic imperatives that, oh, you have to go to work for this capitalist because if you don't, then you're not going to be able to support yourself. And that's very bad. But you know what's even worse is hard coercion of like a gun to the head, right? Of saying that, you're going to be ordered by the state to do this and you better do it, right? So one obvious worry about getting rid of all market mechanisms before we get to that point is that instead of increasing human freedom by going from the soft coercion of economic imperatives to not even having that coercion, we go in the opposite direction. We go from soft coercion to a more direct form of extraction. And I think if you look at the history of the planned economies that exist in the late 20th century, there's some grounds for taking that concern pretty seriously. There's also the question that I mentioned earlier of calculation. How do you line up production priorities with consumer preferences? So you're not in the position of, think about the Soviet Union, forget like the real horrors like the famine in the Ukraine in the 30s and all that stuff. Just think about the Soviet Union when Soviet citizens were relatively comfortable in the 80s, but still resented the shit out of the system because there was no particular guarantee that when they went to a grocery store, the stuff they wanted would be on the shelves, because there were very few incentives built into that system. Somebody mentioned Walmart. I love my friend Lee Phillips and Mikhail Rozworski, who I don't know. They co-wrote a wonderful book called People's Republic of Walmart, which is probably the best case for total planning that I've seen, that brings up the way Walmart internally uses these systems. But I've talked to Lee about this extensively, right? I've had beers with him where we have had long conversations about economic planning, and he doesn't think that we're in a technological place where we could have a 100% planned economy tomorrow. That sounds kind of creepy. Somebody says their neighborhood is funding American flags in every street light in every corner. Not that I'm against American flags. I kind of have the Michael Harrington view about that, but that's still, there's something off-putting about that. Anyway, so even Lee, right, doesn't, co-wrote the People's Republic of Walmart, doesn't necessarily think we're technologically at a point where we could just plan everything with zero market mechanisms tomorrow, right? He thinks that we should see it as a long-term goal and we should try to work towards it. But he thinks that there aren't only political obstacles, there are also technical obstacles that given current technology, that we can't entirely do that right now. So he thinks what I do, which is that we'd have to at least start with some sort of market socialism. Maybe we could go more and more planned from there. So what would that look like, and how do we avoid that self-exploitation problem? Well, let's just real quick talk about what the problem is, and then what I think can be done about it. So when people talk about self-exploitation, right? So they don't literally mean exploitation in the sense of like capitalist exploitation, because when we talk about capitalist exploitation, what we're talking about is that workers don't control the outcome of the surplus value they create. That that basically that some of the value that's created by workers, right? Workers create all value. Sometimes capitalists contribute some, but not by virtue of owning the place, by doing the same kind of thing they could also pay somebody to do. So workers create all value, but they only get to keep some of it, and they don't get to decide how much they keep, right? That like what the distribution is decided by the capitalist. That is what we mean when we talk about exploitation, that we are extracting value from workers to capitalists out of their will, right? And somebody asked in the chat, wasn't the issue the USSR was undemocratic? Partially, but I don't think that was the only issue. Here's why I don't think so. I think that it's true that the worst horrors of the Soviet system and its equivalent in other capital C communist countries did have a lot to do with lack of democracy. I don't think things like that 1930s Ukrainian famine or the horrors of the Great Leap Forward in China, I don't think those things would have happened in a more democratic version of the same system. But when you say, oh, the problem is that it's not democratic, I think the challenge is to say, okay, well, what's the more democratic model that would have worked better? And at least as a starting point, we could imagine taking the basic structure of the Soviet economy and layering on political democracy. That, in other words, the Soviet economy would work exactly the way the actual Soviet economy works, but there would be free speech and a free press and real multi-party elections, and then whatever party won a majority in parliament would form a government and appoint the head of Gosplan, the Soviet planning office. And in that economy, I'm sure things like the 1930s Ukrainian famine, the Holodomor, and the Great Leap Forward in China, I'm sure things like that wouldn't have happened, because those are really extreme, grisly policies that would not have been pursued if Stalin now had to worry about being voted out in the next election. But the kind of problem that Soviet citizens were so frustrated by, even in the 80s, right, when nobody was starving, nothing like that was going on, right? The system was probably at its best, but there were all these extreme frustrations with it. They were a big part of why so many Soviet citizens not only didn't defend that system when it was collapsing, but welcomed its collapse initially. They soon grew to regret it, because the kind of kleptocratic gangster capitalism that replaced it was much worse. But Jave says in Super Chat, thank you for your content. I listen during work. Thank you. That actually really means a lot to me, brother. Thank you. Or sister, possibly. That's a I'm not sure about the name, but in any case, that's part of it, of course, was resentment of the political authoritarianism, but part of the reason why the citizens of those countries resented those systems so much was because of that mismatch between production priorities and consumer preferences. That all of the little fine-grained preferences that we have, right? That, like, just take a minute to think about what your grocery list looks like, right? If you have a housemaid or a husband or a wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, who sometimes does the grocery shopping, you say, oh, I want this, I want that, right? Think about how incredibly specific those preferences are, right? That the mismatch between that and production is not necessarily going to be solved just by layering political democracy on top of the Soviet system. I think that in the democratic version of the Soviet Union that I just talked about, again, I don't think the Ukrainian famine would have happened, but I don't think that if I show up to grocery stores, I kind of just have to hope they've got what I want. I don't think those logistical problems would necessarily be solved. And I disagree with McMindfulness, who moved my cheese, who says if we see the calculation argument, we're ceding the entire argument against capitalism. I think that's just false. I think that we can take those issues seriously, but I think we can say, one, we might eventually get a high-tech solution to them that's consistent with having a completely marketless version of socialism, that kind of fully automated luxury communism. Fully automated luxury communism kind of vision of a completely marketless socialist future. Two, even if we do need some market mechanisms right now, that doesn't mean that we just have to stick with capitalism, right? I don't think our only choices are trying to get rid of markets entirely and living with the division of society into a subservient working class and a ruling class. I think we can solve the second problem without immediately getting rid of markets if we don't entirely know how to do that yet. What does that look like? Well, I'm actually working on a book about this subject right now. Early stages, we just wrote the proposal, but I'm co-writing a book about this with Bhaskar Sankara, the founding editor of Jacobin, and the third co-author is an Australian economist named Mike Beggs. I think we were going to call it Life After Capitalism at one point, he wasn't sure if this was too Jay-Z, but Bhaskar was talking about just calling it the blueprint. But in any case, so what if we do? Again, I'm totally open to the idea of some high-tech, approximation, shadow markets, whatever. If we can figure out how to do that well, I'm for it, right? But while we're trying to figure that out, what would a realistic version of feasible socialism look like? Yeah, exactly. Yes, the life after capitalism was a reference to the Schweikart book, which I'm a big fan of. When you go to Red Emma's, buy that one too. So that's After Capitalism by David Schweikart. That's Schweick. All right. I see in chat it's spelled H-A-R-T. I thought it was just spelled A-R-T after that, but it doesn't matter. Just After Capitalism, David S., right? You'll find it. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that book. And yeah, that was when we were going to call it Life After Capitalism. It would be an homage to it. And I think he's basically right. I think Schweikart's model is like 95% correct. I think it needs some improvements around the edges to answer some problems that I don't think he has good answers to. But overall, I think he nailed it, right? So what does that look like? That sort of Schweikart system, or the kind of system that Bhaskar and Mike Beggs and I are proposing in the book we're working on right now, while we're figuring out for the higher tech version to happen, right? And again, somebody mentions Walmart, even Lee Phillips, co-author of People's Republic of Walmart. I've talked to the man about this extensively, and he agrees with me. We have to start with market socialism, and as technology gets better, we'll figure out how to plan more and more, right? So, markets were definitely not completely canned in World War II. There was much more economic planning than there normally is, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't market society. I'd also point out, in terms of World War II, that economic planning at that scale is very good for some things, very bad for others, right? So Bhaskar's metaphor in his first book, The Socialist Manifesto, is that kind of economic planning, right, that very top-down kind of state economic planning is all thumbs and no fingers. In other words, it's really good at things like mass manufacturing tractors, mass manufacturing tanks, right? Just like, hey, our goal for the next 5 years, our 5-year plan, right, is this sector, this sector, this sector. We are going to develop the shit out of them. We are going to just plow through those things. It's very good at that. And thank God for it, because if it wasn't, then the Soviet Union might have lost World War II and Hitler's Germany would have won. But it's very bad. Again, short of some high-tech fix, it's very bad at coordinating production with consumer preferences. So, how can we square this circle? Is it in fact true that somebody says in chat, right, socialism with markets is no socialism at all? Well, it depends what you mean. If what you mean by socialism is overcoming the commodity form, right, which is a very traditional Marxist goal, then no, that's not socialism yet. But if what you mean by socialism is what Marx often talked about, in fact, 99% of the time, Marx isn't talking about overcoming the commodity form. 99% of the time that Marx refers to socialism, he's just talking about who owns the means of production. The phrase he most often uses, cooperative ownership. Or like his address to the inaugural address to the First International, he talked about having modern industrial production without having a class of masters and a class of hands. So that's what you mean again, I'm seeing people refer to the People's Republic of Walmart. Trust me, guys, this is my Marshall McLuhan moment from Annie Hall. The co-author of that book is a friend of mine. I've extensively talked with him about this. He doesn't think we can immediately plan everything tomorrow. He thinks we have to start with market socialism, and gradually, as technology gets better, we'll figure out how to plan more and more. So if what you mean by socialism is extending democracy from politics to economics, we have workers control the means of production. We no longer have society divided into a subservient working class and a dominant ruling class. If that's what you mean by socialism, we can have socialism even before we figure out how to completely get rid of markets and have full communism. So how would that work? Well, what Schweikart lays out in his book After Capitalism, which is roughly what Bhaskar and Mike Beggs and I are advocating in our new book, as far as a starting point, not ending point. Again, I think we might get to that completely marketless, fully automated luxury communism one day. But as a starting point, right, what we call full democratic socialism in the book is a society where, of course, you have greatly expanded public sector. There are lots of things we do want to plan outside the market, and lots of things that we've actually shown that we have figured that out, right, like healthcare. But to the extent that we still need a market sector, we have at least worker-owned firms. Okay, this is where that self-exploitation problem comes in. When people talk about self-exploitation, of course, they don't literally mean exploitation in the sense that you have exploitation under capitalism, which is the extraction of value from workers to capitalists by virtue of their control of the means of production. What they mean is the idea that you'd have what even Marx in Critique of the Gotha Program says we'd have under communism, which is, of course, some of, well, not the value, because he thinks value wouldn't exist at this point, but some of what's created by workers has to go into repairing machines, building new machines, schools, hospitals, other things. It doesn't just all go back to workers in terms of consumption. But the worry is that if we still had markets, even with worker-owned firms, then we would have this equivalent of exploitation. What people talk about when they say self-exploitation, which is that the worry that if a bunch of worker-owned firms are competing with each other, then even in that worker-owned firm, then you end up having to really cut into your own consumption, because in order to outcompete other firms, you have to draw so much money from the general treasury to put into new development to get that competitive edge, that you end up actually consuming a very small portion of the product with the labor. Oh, I am not saying, by the way, I'm not saying the guy who made the argument later disagreed with him. Read The People's Republic of Walmart. Read it all the way to the end. He explicitly says, he and McCall explicitly say in that book that we have to start with market socialism, right? They say that in the book, right? Now, if you think they're wrong, that's great, but don't say, oh, you're wrong because People's Republic of Walmart, when in the text of People's Republic of Walmart, they say what Lee Phillips says to me all the time, right? So in any case, yeah. So if we do still need market mechanisms for a while, right? The concern is self-exploitation, right? That you're going to get worker-owned firms where, in order to gain a competitive edge over each other, people end up having to, even though their pay scales will be determined democratically within the firm, people end up having to pay themselves poverty wages because all the money is being poured into new development to try to get that competitive edge. So how do we solve this? Well, two things. One, I would separate the question of who owns the firm from who owns the physical means of production. This is not original to me. Schweikart says the same thing in his book. And Bhaskar says it in his first book, in the first chapter of this. We'll definitely answer John's questions later. Yeah, no, that's my cat out in the roaming around the hall. He's been in the car for the last 2 days. He's got a lot of meows to get out. So I think that since one of the big obstacles, one of the reasons why worker cooperatives are always such a tiny percentage of every every market economy is because starter capital is wildly unevenly distributed, and there are lots of businesses that are extremely capital intensive. Right? Think about how hard it would be, even if you were a trained dentist, right? But you want to start up your own dental practice. Think about all the machinery you'd have to buy, how much it costs, all that stuff. And you start to get a sense of, yeah, I know he hates being in the car. My wife had got a little kitty sack for him so he can be on her lap during it. And, that makes him calmer, but he still hates it. Or even think about opening up a bar or restaurant, right? Like the capital cost can be insane. And if you are starting off with nothing and you have to get a bunch of loans, paying back loans, again, there's a big problem here, especially with some of these things that are very capital intensive, relatively small profit margins. So Schweikart's solution to that, Bhaskar's solution to that in the first chapter of the Socialist Manifesto is that, okay, even if you do still need a residual market sector of worker-owned firms, rather than having the firms own the physical means of production, the physical means of production should be state-owned, and essentially the firms would rent them from the state, right? So, and the way that would work is that the mechanism would be publicly owned banks giving out grants, not loans, but grants to worker-owned firms for the physical means of production. So in other words, it'd be like a loan, but you'd only pay off the interest, never the principal. And then you also wouldn't be legally allowed to sell off the physical means. You could sell off the physical means of production to buy new, better physical means of production, but you couldn't sell them off to just put in the general fund. They wouldn't belong to you. They belong to the public treasury. And then I think that takes us to the solution to the self-exploitation problem, to the extent that you can solve that problem within what's still basically a market economy, at least in that sector, which is that new development would not, I repeat, would not come out of pulling money out of the general fund of the firm, right? You could not raid the firm's resources to buy new equipment, repair old equipment, open up new locations, all that good stuff. In fact, doing that in this society would be considered to be a form of embezzlement, because the residual claimant would be the worker owners, right? So in other words, once a worker-owned firm has paid its essentially its rental fees for the physical means of production, right, has paid that interest off that original grant, and they've paid the various taxes that they need to pay for the greatly enlarged state sector that also exists, then the residual claimant, all the rest of the money automatically goes to the worker owners. So you could not self-exploit in order to build more stuff. Again, that would be considered embezzlement. Where would the money, of course, does that mean there'd be no new development going on? No, it doesn't. It means that new development would also have to be financed by grants from the publicly owned banks. That doesn't mean that every time there was that doesn't mean that if you have a worker-owned coffee shop, every time you need a new espresso machine, you have to make a special request to the state-owned bank, which might be some like libertarians like nightmare scenario about the society that I'm describing. Oh my God, are the all-powerful state bureaucrats micromanaging every decision by every worker-owned firm? No, it wouldn't, right? What it would mean rather is that your development budget for that year, for perhaps, or however long the operating periods were, an operating period of a worker-owned firm would be, or is, like look at Mondragon, right? Essentially the equivalent of a union contract, except that it doesn't have to be negotiated with anybody. The workers just decided among themselves, and then that's the deal. No, it wouldn't be. They wouldn't be embezzling, because that would be the residual funds would just go to the workers. That would be where it would be legally mandated to go. Says Joe Garrity, thank you for the super chat. Says, what motivates you to keep going strong? Trying not to get black pilled, but it's hard. Show Ben some love with the super chat, y'all. Points for the y'all. Thank you for that. So yeah, we'll answer that in a second, but just to wrap up the point, right? That you would get that for every operating period, right? You could apply for the next operating period for a fund to cover both, repairs for old machinery, new development, opening up new locations, whatever. And so that would be taxpayer financed. So of course you could have a problem in such society, people, more successful firms resenting taxation, etc. But on the other hand, I think even in a completely marketless planned economy, you could have a problem about people resenting the stuff they're making being reallocated to other people. I don't think there's a magical solution to that. Yeah, R.M. Brown says, what about tiny businesses with like 10 people? I think it would be the same thing, right? That it would be, I think, a worker-owned firm that only had, and thank you for the super chat, RM. Yeah, I think a worker-owned firm with 10 people might have a much simpler internal structure than a worker-owned firm with 200 people. It might be that there are a lot more decisions that you could just make through direct democracy, right? You wouldn't, they wouldn't need to be made by like an elected workers council because there were only 10 people originally. But other than that, it would largely be the same, right? So like that coffee shop example again, right? The worker-owned coffee shop, there could only be 10 people in that particular worker cooperative. But nevertheless, the location, the physical location, right, where they are would be rented for the state. The development budget to buy coffee and buy flavoring syrup and buy espresso machines. And if it were a really successful worker-owned coffee shop, go start a new worker-owned coffee, go start a second or a third branch, right? The development funds from all those things would still come from those grants. Maybe if you was so small that maybe you could just do it by GoFundMe or something, but that would be it. Diego, thank you so much for the super chat. Says, thank you, Ben. Left is best. Yes, it is. Yeah, Joe Garrity had asked, what motivates you to keep going strong? Trying not to get black pill, but it's hard. Yeah, it is hard. It's extremely. I mean, look, I don't think we should lie about this. I don't think we should try to sugarcoat it. I um, I think that we need to be honest about how deep some of the defeats that we've experienced lately have been. Right? That we just started to have these openings for at least serious social democracy with Bernie in the U.S. and Corbyn in the U.K. AMLO is a little bit more complicated politically. I did a Jacobin video about him once, but in any case, he won his election, right? But he's also not as radical. As sad as it is to call people who are just social democrats radical, that is the situation we're in, right? But yeah, we'd started to get these very tentative openings that, okay, at least like real serious social democratic reforms are really on the political agenda because, hey, Jeremy Corbyn could become the next prime minister of the UK. Bernie Sanders could become the next president of the United States. And then that all collapsed. Right? Corbyn obviously lost the general election there and had to step down. And Bernie Sanders, after doing that amazing hat trick of winning Iowa, New Hampshire, and then finally Nevada, which was particularly amazing because he won it by a much bigger margin and extremely ethnically diverse working class state. And then then he went down in flames. And that really make things look pretty bleak, right? Because like whether or not you think what I do, which is that realistically, before we can get to any sort of socialism, right? Market socialism, fully automated luxury communism, anything, right? You have to at least start with social democracy. I don't think you have to crawl before you can run. I always think of that scene in Kill Bill with Beatrix Kiddo, right? Uma Thurman trying to wiggle her big toe, right? You can't fight off the crazy 88s in Tokyo unless you start by trying to wiggle your big toe. But whether you agree with me about that, or you think that that social democracy is just a distraction from real revolutionary socialism or whatever you think, either way, it's incredibly dismal and disturbing that even those social democratic baby steps have experienced such great defeat, right? That we are in this situation where even those things have gone down in flames, and the combination of those political defeats with the economic situation and the apocalypse plague, it is very easy to get blackpilled. I totally hear that, right? But I think a couple things to keep in mind, right? Politically, as bad as the situation is, it was 1,000 times worse 10 years ago, right? Democratic Socialists of America has 70,000 members, probably more than that, right? Because I heard that number a while ago. 10 years ago, it had 300, maybe 500. There are multiple people, members of Congress now, who call themselves socialists. AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Cory Bush now. And 10 years ago, it was just lonely Bernie, right? And in some ways, in fact, you get some much more radical socialist flashes sometimes from these people. I'm not saying any of the people that I just named are perfect or that we shouldn't have our criticisms. But, AOC back in January, I wrote an article about this for Jacobin. She talked about converting Amazon into a worker cooperative. She said it's not about money, right? We don't want, refer to Jeff Bezos starting a charitable foundation. We don't want his money. If he really wants to be a good person, he should give up his power and turn Amazon into a worker cooperative. I never thought I'd hear that from a sitting member of Congress. And I think that the situation is bleak. We should not lie about that, but it could be a lot bleaker, and it was a lot bleaker in terms of our starting point. And otherwise, I guess, just remember it's a very long haul. And I understand it's frustrating because, especially given the urgency of climate change, um, then I, I I understand, right? It's incredibly frustrating to think of it as a long haul. And maybe that gets us into some of Christian Parenti's stuff about how to think about climate change and whether we can make it to socialism first, and if not, what some sort of sufficient version of a Green New Deal would look like under capitalism. It's grim, right? Should absolutely admit that it's grim, but I still think that there are grounds for long-term optimism. That we have lost some battles and they've been brutal losses, but we are in a stronger starting point than we were not very long ago, and we will win the war. So that is all that I would say about that. RM Brown, thank you so much for the super chat. Says, what about organizations with artistic decisions like film production, etc.? Sorry if this is a dumb question. It is absolutely not a dumb question. It's a great question because there's a real issue there, right? And so the issue, as I understand it, tell me if I'm getting you right here, would just be this: that if we're talking about workers' control of the means of production, um, does that mean that if you have a film set, for example, right, that absolutely everybody who works in any capacity on the movie gets a equal say in about the like artistic decisions about the movie? I hope not, right? Because that sounds like a recipe for some very bad movies. But I think that you could have. Um, I don't think that's an insoluble problem, right? So for a couple reasons. One, first, you could actually have public sector, movie making, for example, where it's just taken out of the market completely, right? You're just gonna be a state employee, make some movies. We'll give you artistic license, and then these will then be shown free at publicly owned. Well, right now during the pandemic, they'd have to be drive-ins, but as the case may be, right? Um, and but never, you could also even just have worker-owned film, like it could be like, hey, I'm gonna, you know, Quentin Tarantino has the idea for Pulp Fiction. He's living in a market socialist society, so he has to, so what that means is he's starting up a worker-owned enterprise. I think you could have enough leeway to allow for the constitution of that worker-owned enterprise to give him final say on artistic issues. But as to somebody brought up that asshole Stefan Molyneux, who they say always makes this argument that should Brad Pitt be paid the same as a cameraman. Yes, damn it. Unless we really need to incentivize people being actors by paying them way more than cameramen, and frankly, I don't think we do, because I think just the incentive of the social rewards for being for being an actor whose movies lots of people like would be more than enough to get people flocking to that, even without that pay scale. So even in that worker, like Pulp Fiction, the cooperative, right? The one-time worker-owned production company for Pulp Fiction, the scenario I'm giving you. Yeah, I think just validation would be more than enough to get people to want to be actors, even if they were not paid more than cameramen. I'm not worried about that. So yeah, look, in that scenario, it could be that the constitution of the enterprise gives Tarantino, some autonomy about artistic decisions, but economic decisions, what the pay scales are, how much the cameramen get paid versus how much the actors are paid, how the profits of the film are distributed, all of those would be made by the workers, and I don't think that would be bad for the artistic integrity of it at all. Yeah, as somebody points out in the comments, people act for free all the time in local theater productions, and granted, right, we want, like, I think, in professionally made movies, the quality of the acting tends to be higher probably than most local theater productions, but that doesn't mean that you wouldn't have lots and lots of people who wanted to do it and lots to choose from for those on-camera roles, even if you weren't paying them more than cameramen. I'm very skeptical about the claim that wouldn't be the case. All right. Um, hey, this I ended up going way longer than I thought I would today because this was so much fun. So if anybody has any last questions, take one or two real quick. But otherwise, I think I'm going to cut it. As I mentioned earlier, um, my wife and I just got in from 2 days on the road, driving from Georgia to Michigan, and have oh yeah, somebody mentioned the debut of the Gravel Institute. R.M. Brown says in super chat, "Thank you for the answer, Ben. You are rad. Thank you so much, much appreciated, brother." Yeah, look, somebody says most film companies would have a problem with worker enterprise. Yeah, no kidding, right? I mean, most capitalist enterprises of any kind, right? The people who own them wouldn't want to have to give up their power. So instead of being able to exercise kingly power over the company you own, um, then they'd have to submit to the democratic will of the workers, right? Who would want that, right? You're going to get about as many capitalists lining up for transition to workers' control voluntarily as you are get feudal kings lining up for transition to making their countries democratic republics. That's why you need to have uh, that's why you need to have like class struggle is the only way you're going to get there, right? What you need is for all the people, right, who don't benefit from the system, which is way more than the people who do, to join forces to override the people who don't. Oh wow, somebody mentioned in the chat Uncle John cider. I don't have to search for it. I've been going to it since I was a kid. I grew up in East Lansing. Uncle John cider mill is like 15 minutes drive away. Been there many times. Like that place a lot. Um, could tell you a funny story about that, but I really did mean what I said about getting going and finally having some dinner. Really appreciate all of you guys. This was a lot of fun to do. I'm glad, even though we had to move it from Wednesday to Thursday this week, and we ended up having to start it at 7 instead of 5, like was planned, because it took so long to get here. There's so many delays, but I'm really glad we did it. Uh, this would uh, this would be a lot of fun. This see, I'm so tired I can't talk. This has been a lot of fun. This is always a lot of fun. Um, Thank you guys so much. Left is best.